다음 그 유명한 파르마 사람 유네 다 공소 제베드니 차리요레 트레인류다리
Here we are holding the special Kajimulan over the internet. So I'd like to wish my greetings to all the lamas, tulkus, and spiritual friends, the monks and nuns in the monasteries who are listening over the internet, as well as all the lay men and women who are listening to it. Wish you my warmest welcomes. Yesterday, I began to speak about Atisha's life and liberation, but there's really no more time than just 3 days at the Milam to speak about it. So today is the second day, and tomorrow is the third day. And so I should finish tomorrow on the third day. Actually, I really didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare for this teaching on Atisha's life and liberation. I got very busy and I didn't have much time. And there's also not a whole lot of time to teach. So I can't really teach it at length, but I think I should just speak about the most important points. To speak about his entire life and liberation is a little bit difficult. Yesterday I spoke about the birth of Atisha, his birthplace, the time he was born, and so forth. And I also spoke about how from a young age Atisha studied a lot of Tantra. So next I'd like to speak a little bit about how Atisha went forth and was ordained. Now the main circumstances, the causes and circumstances that brought Atisha to go forth, because at first Atisha was a practitioner of Vajrayana. So how is that going? He went from being a tantric practitioner to wanting to go forth. So when he was young, Atisha practiced a lot of Vajrayana, and he had a lot of instructions on the mantra, and he basically mastered the topics of mantra. His original idea was to reach Buddhahood in this lifetime solely through tantric practice, and so that is what he thought to himself originally. And so his original idea was to devote himself to tantric practice. But there were many different signs that he should go forth. Now, one time, in his dream, a Heruka came to the sky in front of him and said to him, "Child of noble family, if you keep doing the practice of Avadutipa's conduct, that will not be enough for you to get anywhere. So you need to go forth and become a monastic. And if you do, then in the future you will be able to foster many monastic students." And so he made this prophecy to him. And then there's an even more amazing dream than that. So one night, he dreamt that he was in a big temple. So Atisha would imagine he went into this, and inside this there was the Buddha Bhagavan Shakyamuni surrounded by a large sangha of bhikshunis. And they were all eating their midday meal. They're having lunch. They're having their midday meal. And Atisha himself was at the end of the row, he dreamt. And while he was sitting there at the front of the row, the Buddha saw Atisha at the end of the row, and he pointed his finger at him. He said, "Something happened to that person." So what happened? Why he didn't go forth? And so he dreamt that, and he had this dream. It was kind of an amazing dream, right? Another night in his dream, he imagined that Maitreya was in a temple wearing monastic robes. As he was wearing the monastic robes and is sitting in the temple, and Maitreya thought he should go approach him. But Maitreya said, this is a place for monastics to go, but it's not a place for you householders to come, so you shouldn't come here. And so, this is what he dreamt Maitreya said. So there's so many such signs. And because of them, Atisha himself thought to himself, oh, really? I definitely have to go forth. And so he had that thought. So at that time, there was a landowner or a householder from whom Atisha usually would rent rooms when he was in Nalanda. And this householder knew a lot about the Dharma. And at that time, there were many different Buddhist schools. And he knew a lot about the situation of Buddhism at that time as well. And so Atisha said, I'd like to go forth. And so which school should I go forth into? Which school should I become a monk in? Because there are many different schools of the foundation vehicles, right? And so there are many different schools. So which is the best school for me to go forth in? And so he asked this, and when he did, this landowner said to him, are you going to keep doing Vajrayana practice or not? Are you going to stop doing Vajrayana practice when you go forth, or are you going to continue doing them? This is a very, pointed question. And Atisha said, even after I go forth, I want to keep doing Vajrayana practice. And when he said that, then the householder said, if that's the case, then you need to go, it's best for you to go forth in the Mahasanghaka school. And he offered that opinion. So, taking that opinion, when Atisha was 29, he went to Bodh Gaya. Now, at that time, there are many different temples there. There was one that was called the Madhavihara. And he went to that temple, and he went forth there. Now, some other story accounts say that he went forth at the Odantapuri monastery. In any case, there are different accounts of the place where he went forth, but if you ask who was the Khenpo from he went forth, it was a master of the Mahasanghaka school. And within there are, of course, many different sub-schools within the Mahasanghaka. And so it's in particular the sect of the school of transcending the world. And so the master in this was a master called Buddhagyana. And he was probably a master of Padmasambhava. So he was a very well-known master. So that's in the tradition of his students. Like also later, it was said that this master Buddhagyana had also achieved the level of the path of joining. And so they're the master, the master from whom Atisha took the vows was Shilarakshita. And the name he was given, the monastic name he was given was Dipankara Sridhyana. We say Dipankara Sridhyana, so if you explain it in Tibetan, Dipam means a lamp, Kara means to do, or the doer, and the Shri means glorious, and Jnana means wisdom. So Dipankara Sridhyana is his name. So the Khenpo who ordained and was in the tradition of Master Buddhagyana. So all the people in Buddha-Jana's lineage had the word jhana at the end of their name. This is the tradition to give them that as the last word of their name. And so for that reason, he's called Dipankara Sri Jhana. That's why the word jhana is on the end of Atisha's name. And so among the Jotimba's 30 praise and 30 verses, it says, without attachment to her pleasures, he left the wealth of royalty, became a bhikshu of the Mahasangika school. I supplicate glorious Atisha. And so this is telling us that he went forth in the Mahasangika school. And so from then on, then Atisha refrained from even the smallest offense of the Vinaya. Even the most minor and the subtle offenses of the Vinaya. He was very strict about even these very minor offenses and kept his vows very clean. To give an example of this, for example, one time, like there are clay cups. So he was given some sort of flour or some sort of ground grains or so forth. We'd have to say, if he was given like, so if he's given any flour that is put in a clay pot, he wouldn't eat it. And that's the reason why. It's because the clay pot is for beer. Because in old days, because they normally make beer in clay pots, and so for that reason, this is because he used clay pots to keep beer. Of course, he had to give up beer, but he also used not only would he not eat any alcohol, he wouldn't have anything that came from a container that could be used for alcohol. And one of the reasons why I was particularly strict about observing the rule of not having any alcohol is because in the Mahasangika school, they add the not drinking alcohol to the 4 root vows and make it as a 5th root vow. They have a very strict practice. So for that reason, Atisha himself wouldn't even drink food from a clay pot, even whether the pot had been used for alcohol or not, because clay pots were normally used for alcohol. He would not even eat foods that were kept in clay pots. In any case, what Atisha himself said is, I've never had any faults at all or offenses at all in my Pratimukta vows. There have been a few minor faults in the Bodhisattva treatises. I had many faults of the Tantric Samaya, but I haven't left any of them for more than a day. If there's a fault that happened today, then he would confess it today and purify it today. If there's a fault that he did one day, he wouldn't do it the next or the day after that. And only then confess it. Instead of that, if a fault occurred today, he would confess it today. And if he fault occurred the next day, he would confess that on the same day. So next, I'd like to speak a little bit about how Atisha got his name. So Atisha had many different names. We could say, so different names. He basically was called by different names. Now, the most common name used in Sanskrit for him is, one of them is Atisha. So if we translate the word Atisha, it means preeminent, the greatest, or the most excellent. Generally, in many ways, you can explain the word Atisha. Some people would say that the word Ati means expense, and Ashya means the intention. If you join the truth, so the Atisha, then it would mean like it would mean like the most someone with the most excellent intentions. Some people would say that the word Ati means exceedingly. Shati means Shanti means peaceful. So when you combine the two, you get extremely peaceful. So that's another way of explaining it. Another way to explain it is that the word Atisha has, so that A means a great yoga, T means a great pandita, and Sha means a great picture. That's another explanation of his name, because it can be understood to mean Avadutipa. And so for that reason, he can be understood as being a great yogi. T refers to the word T, to the T in Pandita. And Shah could say that it could say means a picture, but I think it might be understood as a shramana. And so this is another explanation of the name. In any case, there are many different ways his name Atisha can be explained. But how was he given this name Atisha? Because there are basically two different accounts for this. Now, one of these is from Tenzin Sudok's History of the Kadampa, the Ornament of the Mind. And what it says in there is that the Hlalama Chanchu saw that Adisha had superior knowledge and compassion. He was like different than other Indian Panditis. He was like superior to them. And he saw that he'd be able to help the precious teachings flourish even more than before. And so he gave him the name Adisha as a way of praising him. Another account is from the Sapya Kunsa History of the Kadampa. Now, what it says is there's a king named Dharmapala. So there was a Dharmapala in the Pala dynasty in India. He's a very well-known king. And at that time, Atisha was superior to all of the other Panditas and Siddhas in India. So he invited him to Vikramashila and gave him the name Atisha. However, this king, Dharmapala, if he is the Dharmapala of the Pala dynasty, then the time period doesn't match. Because King Dharmapala was, of course, there are many different explanations about him, because the Indian histories are not clear. And so basically everything is just making inferences or guesses. And so he was one of the, so there are many different positions, even though he was a well-known king of the Pala dynasty, there are many different positions about when he was. But later, most Indian historians say that this king was from the 8th century. And so if he was from the 8th century, then he's from a different time period from Atisha. Atisha was from basically the 10th century, so the time period doesn't match. In Taranatha's history of Buddhism in India, at the point where he's describing Atisha, he says that the king of the Pala dynasty who reigned he does not say that the king of the Pala king at that time it was Dharmapala. He said instead of the Bayapala. So this is another point that needs some investigation. So in a case that perhaps it is more logical that Chanchu gave him that name. I think that there is a bit more reason to say, and I think it's more likely the factual case. So that's how he got the name Adisha. But one of the names that's most frequently used for him in Tibet is Joje. The word Joje is the two Jo statues in the area of Lhasa. So there are the two Jo statues in Tibet, and they're both called Jo. They're called the two Jo statues. And then there's the only difference is whether it's the ending J on the word, but the meaning, the word Jo is the same. Now, in terms of Sanskrit, then Jo would be a translation of the Sanskrit word Swami. Like these days, there are many different Indian Swamis, right? There are a lot of Hindu lamas called Swami, right? And so it's the same Sanskrit word. So generally in Tibetan, the word Jo can mean your king or your leader. Sometimes it can be understood as someone who is older than you. Like you call an older son, like Ajo or Jojo or Jola. And so I think that the word Joel comes from that same root. Or it can mean like the Zhou and Lhasa statue in Lhasa. It can mean the Buddha statue in the Sambhogakaya robes and ornaments. So basically, the Zhou is not just any Buddha statue, but it's one who's wearing the Buddha statues that are in the Sambhogakaya form with all their ornaments and robes are called Zhou statues. In any case, Zhou is a word of praise. It means like the main or the supreme, someone for whom you have a lot of attachment and regard, the most important among all. That's a word indicating, it's a word of praise, explaining how much you cherish someone. In any case, when the only Lama whom Tibetans call Zhou is Atisha, there's really no one else. And I think this shows, and I think this shows how close Tibetans feel to Zhou and how much gratitude they have for his kindness. Tibetans have a different feeling from Zhou than for any other Lama, and they have kind of a different way of seeing from the very bottom of his hearts. And so they use this word that's like a very high praise and extremely respectful. So I think that's how he got this name. And so that's how Zhou was given his name. And from the time that he went forth at the age of 29, he studied quite a few different Mahayana texts from many different gurus. And in terms of the text of the foundation vehicle, at that time there are the four Nikayas. So the Nikayas are that time the four root schools: the Mahasangaka, the Theravada, Mahasamata, and the Sarvastivada. The reason why they're called the four root schools, usually we talk about the two main schools, or the four main schools. There are many different positions on this, but at the time of Atisha, when they say the word four main schools, this meant that among the 18 different schools, these meant the most widespread of the schools, the ones that were still extant, the greater schools. So that these, so they're the larger schools of that time. So they're called the four great schools. So later there are the four great schools. So one of these is the Mahasangha. There is the Theravada, the Mahasamata, and the Sarvastivada school. And so these are the four schools. And each of these schools had their own sutras and Abhidharma and Vinaya, and their texts were slightly different. But he had faith in all of them. And he studied all of the three aspects of their studies. And he also knew the practices of all four schools without mixing any of them up. For example, like he even knew how the monks are offering Alban Buddha. Like when you're having school, one of the complicated points of the Vinaya is how you are given your you're given your alms bowl at the meal. And so he knew all the difference in how this is explained in the different schools. And at that time, he also studied the text that was considered a common to all schools. At this time, this is the Great Exposition by the 800-volume text by the Arhat Gupta. So now at this time, whether this is the same text as the Great Exposition treatise that is preserved in Chinese. But in any case, here's the one that was written by Upagupta. So some people say it had 800 volumes, some people had 300 volumes, but in any case, it had a lot of volumes. So there are hundreds of volumes. It's a very long text. And so Atisha studied this whole text. And the guru from whom he studied was, at that time, there was a monastery called the Udantapuri Monastery, and there was a lama there named Dhammarashita. So that's who he studied this text from. So generally, in order to study this text, it was said to take 12 years to study this text, but Atisha was so diligent that he actually studied it all entirely in 8 years. Now, at that time, while he was studying the Great Exposition, he would go every 6 days to Lama Guru Dhammarakshita. He'd study for 6 days, and then on the seventh day, when they got to the seventh day, instead of going to see the church, he'd leave. So every day he would leave the borders, go outside of the borders of the monastery. And he'd stay there for 6 days, then he'd leave on the seventh day. And the reason why he did this is that in the secret mantra, it said that you should not spend more 7 days with the Shravakas. This is like one of the main vows of the Vajrayana. It's like a Samaya commitment that he had. And so in order to not violate his Samaya, he would only stay for 6 days, as Gauntlet Bishirap explained. Likewise, at that same time, Atisha studied with many different gurus, and he would, in order to study with the gurus, he'd go to all sorts of different places. He went throughout India. He went to many different islands as well. He crossed the Great Ocean 3 times. He sailed on the ocean 3 times. And he went to Central India and Sumatra and Ceylon. He went to many different islands. And he went with a lot of hardship to study with his gurus. At those days, sailing across the ocean was extremely dangerous. So basically, he followed many gurus in his lifetime. And there are different accounts of this in his various biographies. Some of them say that he followed 157 lamas. That's probably that's basically the maximum that he studied was 157, and the minimum was 30s, in the 30s. So there's no time to give an explanation to each of all of them, so I shan't. So we don't need to speak about how he followed each of those gurus. But among them all, there were 3 who were like the real extraordinary ones. And they're the 3 gurus who taught him bodhicitta. So he had 3 lamas with whom he studied bodhicitta, from whom he received teachings on bodhicitta. So who are these 3 gurus? There's Dhammarakshita, Maitreya Yogan, and Guru Suvarnadvipa. These are the 3. So I thought I should give a little brief introduction to each of these. The first one is Dhammarakshita. And so what was he like? There is said in the oral histories that there was got a really particular illness, and in order to heal that illness, among the medicines he needed to have some human flesh and blood. And so when Lama Rakshita heard this, he, without any hesitation, cut some flesh of his body and gave it to that person for his medicine. For him to do something like this is something that's difficult for ordinary people us to get our heads around. If you had to cut a piece off your body and give it to someone else, it's difficult. In any case, this Guru Dhammarakshita, it's not only that he had trained his mind in exchanging self for mother, who's actually able to give the flesh of his own body. And this is because of the very high level of his practice of bodhicitta. And the second was a guru named Maitreya Yogi. There's another story about Maitreya Yogi, that there was someone who was beating a dog with an iron rod. He's striking the dog with an iron rod and abusing the dog. And when the guru saw this, then he immediately felt great compassion for that dog. And he took the dog's suffering onto his own body. And when he took the dog's suffering onto his own body, then he didn't only take the dog's feelings of pain and sickness, he also took the physical suffering of this. So Maitreya on his own body, he got big welts on his body from the iron rod, and they were dripping pus. So he intentionally took the other suffering upon himself. If we look at the story, then we could immediately see that Guru Maitreya was not just an ordinary guru, he had an extremely high level of practice of loving kindness, compassion. So in general, we can see that he came to a very high, not just an ordinary level of mind training practice, but a really high level of the practice of loving kindness. But it's just a special level. Now, the third is Suvarnadvipa, or Sailingpa in Tibetan. Now, Suvarnadvipa was actually said to be the embodiment of bodhicitta. We say what it means that it's embodiment of bodhicitta. It's like the Guru himself was like living bodhicitta. The Buddha himself, the Guru himself was bodhicitta. When you don't have to say the Guru and the Guru's bodhicitta as being separate, the Buddha himself was like the representation of the living bodhicitta himself. And because of this, we can see that the level of the Savanavira's realization of loving kindness and compassion, bodhicitta, or his level of loving kindness and practice, compassion and bodhicitta, or this practice, was at an extremely high level. So among all the different gurus that Atisha followed, the one for whom he had the greatest faith and the deepest devotion and commission was Suvarnadvipa. And the way we can tell this is that, like for other gurus, he didn't have any reliquary. So a reliquary, what we mean is like this. After the Lama passed away, there are the relics. It's like a little, I think it means a little stupa that you'd put the relics of the guru's remains. And so Atisha had a particular, so didn't have a tradition of making reliquaries for all his gurus, but he did have one for Suvarnadvipa, and that had a silver parasol on top of it. And likewise, Gachar didn't say do monthly offerings, or it means like the anniversaries for his other gurus. So there's a tradition of making offerings to the gurus on the anniversaries of their death, but he didn't do this for his other gurus, but he did do it for Suvarnadvipa. So I think this is basically the same as the Tibetan observance of observing the anniversary of Guru's Parnavana, and some say that this came from Atisha. Now, another special thing that it is, when he heard the names of his other gurus, he would join his hands in prayer at his heart, and to show his respect. But when he heard Suvarnadvipa's name, he would again join his palms at the crown of his head. He would join them at the crown of the head to show that they had a really different devotion for Suvarnadvipa than for the other gurus. But when he heard about other gurus, then he wouldn't shed any tears. But when he remembered Suvarnadvipa, the tears would flow. And it's just, so for this reason, when Atisha went to Tibet, he had a lot of advanced students, and they said to him, you had a lot of different gurus. You had followed so many gurus. So why is it that you pay such respect to Suvarnadvipa? Why is it you have such great respect for him? And what Atisha said is, I had a lot of different gurus. I followed many gurus, but among them, I can't say that this is better and this is worse, or this guru has a higher qualities, these have lower qualities. There's no difference in that. All of them only had high qualities. All of them are good. This is not any difference of being better or worse. So my reason for having such faith for Suvarnadvipa, and not as much for that, is not because of the different of their qualities, the difference of their devotion for them. I have faith in all of them, but Suvarnadvipa was the kindest one to me. This is what he said. And so you asked, well, how is he so kind to you? Atisha said, there's really nothing I can't say in mind that I have any qualities, but there's one quality, say, that I have a little bit of a good mind. I have a little bit of goodness. I think if this is my quality, then that you could say that that's what it is. And that having a little bit of a good mind is because a kind heart is because of Suvannadvipa's kindness. Having a little bit of a good heart is Suvannadvipa's kindness. Now, another thing that he said is that without Suvannadvipa, I wouldn't have this bodhicitta of exchanging self for others. It was only after he had met Suvannadvipa that he was able to do the practice of exchanging himself for others. Before that time, so Suvannadvipa means actually a place in present-day Indonesia. In Indonesia, there's a large island called Sumatra. It's one of the largest islands in the world. I think it's like the 7th largest island in the world, they say. In any case, it's a very large island in the ocean. And the old ancient name for it, these days we call it Sumatra, but in the medieval period, this island was called Suvannadvipa. And the reason was, if you translate the name, it means the golden island. So Suvarna means gold, Dvipa means island. So it means like the Isle of Gold. So we call it the Isle of Gold. So these days we don't use that word anymore. So in the latter half of the 7th century, probably in 671, the Tang Dynasty translator Yi Jing went twice to that island. And if you combine the amount of time he spent there over the 2 visits, it's over 2 years. The reason why he was Suvannadvipa stayed there, he was called Suvannadvipa. So some people say that he was also the king of this. He was also a king, he was also the guru, and so for that reason he was called. It's the reason why he was that is because he lived in that country and he was the guru and the king or whatever. And so for that reason he was called. So it's probably either a guru or a king in the island. So for that reason, it was called Suvannadvipa. Now, because of the different lack of time, I'm not able to speak about how he met Suvannadvipa and how he studied with Suvannadvipa. But if I have time, I'll talk about it later. So in general, Atisha followed many gurus from the Mahayana lineages, both the middle way and the mind only. And Suvannadvipa and Shantipa Lamas were masters who upheld the mind only tradition. So if we look at Atisha's life and liberation in detail, I think he primarily focused on the practice of the lineage of vast conduct that were passed down from Suvannadvipa. I think he probably paid most attention to the practice. In any case, one sort of particular feature of Atisha is that he combined the middle way view and the vast practice of the mandala, and he practiced them in union. So this is like a special feature of Atisha. And so for that reason, even within Tibetan Buddhism, is very influential in having like a unified practice of the middle way view and the vast practice of the middle way of the mind only. And I think this comes down to Atisha. Also later, after he had gone forth, and he studied for a long time, and after he had done a lot of studying, he became very very knowledgeable. And according to Tadanath's History of Dharma in India, Atisha became the abbot of the Vikramashila monastery. Also, there's an Odantapuri monastery. And he also was a Kempo or an abbot there. Likewise, as I meant before, another thing that's different about Atisha is he had a really good character. And he was someone who connected nicely with everyone. He treated everyone well.
그 대화 탐지기确实先나.
And so he studied the Dharma of all the different schools, and he tried to be harmonious with all the schools. And so he was revered as a guru of all the different schools. It's like a general lama for all the different schools in India of the time. And so this way, Atisha's activity spread throughout India, but we haven't really got time to speak about all of that today, so we won't speak about that. So next, I'd like to speak about how Atisha was invited to Tibet. It was different in medieval times than it is today. If you wanted to bring Indian Panditas to Tibet, or if a Tibetan student wanted to go to India, it is extremely difficult. These are things that we just can't conceive of. You had to do such limitless hardships to go through it, particularly at the time that Atisha was one of the most famous, important gurus in India, and he was like extremely important and influential Buddhist guru. So it was like, you couldn't just go and invite him to India, they could just immediately go. So what were the reasons and the circumstances why they were able to bring Atisha to Tibet? So what were the reasons? What's the reason why they invited him? Now, were the circumstances that allowed them to bring him to Tibet? So the first thing we need to understand is we need to understand what the situation of Buddhism in Tibet was like. So in Tibet, or in the beginning of the 7th century, the time of the Tibetan king Sonzon Gampo at the beginning of the 7th century, the Buddhism began to spread in Tibet. If you ask in general, there are different, when Buddhism began to spread in Tibet, there are many different accounts of it, but the most reliable sources, so that it was from the time of Sonzon Gampo that Buddhism began to spread in Tibet. So this is the most reliable source. And it's probably during the time of Kizang Drisang Dendsen that Buddhism really spread very widely. That was 4 generations later, though. There was a king named Dharma Udam. So we call him Lang Dharma. Lang is sort of like a nickname we give him. It's actually, if you say Dharma Udam Tsen says his name, then it's kind of a little bit of a honorific word. His actual name is Dharma Udam. So Dharma Udam Tsen, if we count him, he was the 4th king in the line after King Drisang. So in 841, he persecuted Buddhism and wiped out Buddhism. And he prohibited the formation of monasteries. So in 844, he wiped out Buddhism, and 50 years later, in 892, there was Lachin Gompa Rabsa. So Lachin Gompa Rabsa, so Lachin Gompa Rabsa was born 50 years after Lang Dharma had wiped out the Khmer. He's the one who propagated the lower Vinaya lineage. And then there are many who came to receive Vajram. There are many who went to see him, went from central Tibet to Kham to take vows from him. And their students then went to central Tibet. And so when they returned to central Tibet, then at that point they only began to rebuild monasteries and to establish sanghas. And it's only then that the teachings began to be revived. And so what this is called is the later spread of the teaching. So this is later, right? So how many generations were there between Long Dharma's persecution of Buddhism and the re-establishment of the Sangha in central Tibet? There are different descriptions of them, but it's probably generally accepted as more than 100 years. Of course, there's a lot more to say about that, but I don't have time because of to say it all today. In any case, because of the activity of Lagompa Rabsel and other lamas, the Vinaya teachings that were in Kham were able to spread into central Tibet, and this is called the spread of the teachings from lower Tibet. At the same time, an area that we call, there was a revival of the teachings in the area we call Ngari in present day. And when we speak about the revival of the teachings in Ngari, then we need to speak about the Hla Lama and his nephews. So Hla Lama and his nephews means that there was the king Langdharma who persecuted Buddhism, right? And this Tibetan king Langdharma had two sons. One was named Usum and one was called Yumten. And there was a lot of conflict between the two. So Usum and Yumten, whether they were sons or not, there's a different question, but we don't need to speak about that all. In any case, there were two sons, Usung and Yumten, and they disagreed over who should become the king, and they probably had a lot of conflict. They had a lot of debates over it, and then because of that, then by the end of the 9th century, the Tibetan Empire was fragmented into many different parts, and so it was broken into many smaller kingdoms. So after the Tibetan kingdom was fragmented, then the descendants of Yumten, actually, they continued to hate the descendants of Usung, and they wouldn't let Usung's nephew Deni Magun stay in central Tibet, so they had to flee to an area called Shangshung. So this Shangshung is the area that we nowadays call Ngari. And when he went there, he established a kingdom there. After he established the kingdom there, then later he had three sons. He had three sons. In order that he wouldn't have any conflict between his sons, he divided the region of Ngari into three different parts and gave each of them a different area. And because he gave them each of them, you talk about the three regions of Ngari. And so this term, the three regions of Ngari, originated at that time. Before that, there was no discussion of the three regions of Ngari. So it's because of Deni Magun divided Ngari into three parts, gave one to each son. There's another thing I thought I should speak about, the digression here. Sometimes when you talk about the Tibetan Dharma state, sometimes there's no choice but to talk about the Ngari. But there's a Tibetan history that was. So in Tibet is divided into three parts: the upper, lower, and the western part. And this is sometimes people said that it comes from the time of Ngari, but actually this is first mentioned in the Mongolian, the Yuan dynasty things. And so at this point, that in the Yuan dynasty, it says the Tibetan manuscripts say that Tibetan, that the central Tibet is considered a single part. And of course, there are many different descriptions about the three areas of Tibet. In any case, that's a digression. Kide Nimagun divided the three areas of the three areas of Ngari were divided into three, and he gave the area around Purang to his second son, Tashi Degun. And he established his own command, and it also became very well because it's called the Guge dynasty. So it's called the Guge dynasty. Tashi Degun had two sons himself. The elder one is called Songe. Songo was born in 965 in the Common Era. And when he became an adult, then he became the second king of the Guge dynasty. But later, he gave up the kingship and he went forth. And the name he was given was the Hla Lama Yeshe. The reason called the Hla Lama is because he formerly had been the king and later went forth as a monk. So the word Hla, we call the king Hla, or God. And so in the Lama, so the king became Lama, so they called the Hla Lama. And so that's why he was called by that name. Now, Hla Lama Yeshe, before he went before, he of course was married and he had two sons, and his two sons also both went forth. Both he and his sons also had great faith and devotion in the true Dharma, and they offered a lot of service to Dharma. Think about Hla Lama Yeshe. He had a very strong influence on Tibetan history. The way he had such influence, and one is that he had the vow transmission of the three palas and so forth established and spread. And this is the source of the upper transmission of the Dharma. So the upper transmission of the Vinaya is because of him. And the second reason is that he invited Ishan. So this is his second main legacy. And the third is that he fostered many and supported many translators, including the great translator Rinchen Sampo. And so they began translating many different texts, especially the new translation of the secret mantra. And so this is like his third legacy. But it says an oral story is that it said that Yeshe, in order to invite Atisha, went looking for gold. And at that time, the king of Garlok captured him and wouldn't release him. And in order to have him released, his nephew Chang looked for a lump of gold, and he went to Garlok and asked him to please release the king. But he still wouldn't release. And in the end, Garlok said that that Yeshe was actually died in Garlok. But this is something we need to examine, of course. For the reason there is a Guge Pandit Ngawang Drakpa. He was probably a student of Tsongkhapa, if I'm not mistaken. So the Guge Pandit Ngawang Drakpa. Wait a minute. Now, was he a student of Tsongkhapa? I think he might have been. In any case, Guge Pandit Ngawang Drakpa was from the area of Guge. And he took many old manuscripts that are kept in papers, are kept in Ngari Toling, and used these to make a history of the Guge dynasty and also Hla Lama Yeshe. And what he says in there is that even when Hla Lama Yeshe was very old, he would go to Toling, and he'd go and he'd circumambulate the Toling monastery with his carrying a staff. That it also said that at that time, when he was old, when he got to be old, other than one attendant, he wouldn't allow anyone else to see him, and he spent 3 years in a very strict retreat. It also says that he passed away in his room at Tolang Monastery, the female earth sheep here. So if we look at these, the story of Hla Lama Yeshe being captured by the king of Garlok and imprisoned, we have to look at whether that's actually true. Likewise, there's the Drepung Nature Lakang. There's also a really old manuscript. This is called The History of the Guru and the Lineage. It's a biography of Atisha. So it's a manuscript of a biography of Atisha that's probably written in the 12th century. And what it says is that the nephew of Kore. So Kore is probably one of Hla Lama Yeshe's brothers. Some people say that he's a younger brother of Hla Lama Yeshe, and some people say that the elder brother. In any case, he was one of them. In any case, he had a grandson named Hlade. Lade had a son named Wude who was like very wrathful and very violent. He really liked waging war. And so he went to go wage war against the Dak king in Ladakh, Manya. And so this is, and it's in the area of Balti. So in the past days, this was an area of Tibet. Now it's part of Pakistan. But this area of Balti is a place that probably is now part of Pakistan. So, and they probably have all converted to Islam. Within the area of Balti, this is basically Balti, Pakistan, right? And within Balti, there's an area called Drusha. And so they had a war with them, and they lost in the war. And he was captured by the king of Drusha, and he was punished him very severely. So his younger brothers, Changshu and Shu'er, took a lot of gold to go ransom him. But before the the gold arrived, Wude was, he escaped from the prison. When he escaped, from the back, they probably shot him with arrows. And the arrows are poisoned arrows, so he was poisoned. And then he died on the pass. Even before the gold hunters, he'd already escaped from prison, and he was struck by the poison arrow, and he died on the road. So I think we have to see whether I think we have to examine whether it's true that Lama Yeshe was imprisoned by the king of Garlok. So there's a contemporary Tibetan scholar, Gulge Tsiring Gyalpo, who wrote a paper examining whether Lama Yeshe died in Garlok or not. It'd be good to read it. Also, there's a book by Karamiu Samde who has a book called Arrow and Power. It's a very good book, they say. I haven't read it yet. But he says that within this, he says that there are many different scholars have many different positions about whether Lama Yeshe was imprisoned by the king of Garlok or not, so it must be examined. In any case, Lama Yeshe was, I think it's we do need to examine whether it's true that Lama Yeshe was imprisoned by the king of Garlok. So that is enough for today.